austere. But in recent times, your Pakatan Harapan Presidential Council proposed to reduce the price of RON 95, still the same promise lah, which is that hari ni menang esok minyak turun, and to give out, and you push government to give out more subsidies. So let's not argue whether that's the right thing or not. My question is very simple. What exactly is PH's revenue policy that makes it mathematically possible for you to promise these large subsidies and large spending on the part of government?
Thank you, Sharia. Thank you so much for that question. And before I answer the question, I'd like to respond. When you talk about government doing enough in terms of subsidy and controlling the inflation prices, the fact of the matter is, but again, that's very short term. What is the long-term plan to be done? And if, as the government of the day, why can't the minister actually spell out how do you address, for example, food security? Like short-term plans that has long-term repercussions, stopping the export of chicken to Singapore and to outside. Now they are diversified. We have lost a huge market. We have probably lose a huge market in Singapore. Again, short-term policies, long-term repercussions. So the perception is there is no plan. You are only acting one-on-one, on one cases to one case basis. To answer your question, one of the most, as I said, I started the whole debate and discussion that the cancer in our country is corruption. There's so much leakages. Pakatan Harapan in its short tenure has introduced fundamental anti-corruption measures. If you do not recognize it, international index, for example, the CPI recognizes it. We have saved money by cutting costs, by implementing open tender, and as I said, billions which could be pumped into the economy. AG reports, international reports have said that we have lost up to 47 billion due to leakages and wastage. All those could be used to pump into the economy. I know on a short term, I understanding there is a need for more spending, and there's probably a need for borrowing. I'm actually personal, it's not PH. I think we may look at the laws to even increase our debt, especially when we are facing a recession. My philosophy is recession is not the time to be stingy, but it's a time to spend. When it comes to what Ketua Pembangkang said, that is sometimes political rhetoric, but if you look at our PH manifesto, it is clearly stated what has been addressed, how can we address, and indeed, actually, when we took over, the price of petrol was kept lower than it was before. So we did reduce petrol price at that time, but we have a long sustainable plan, and given the chance, we will set in fundamentals, cut out leakages, and find good opportunities with low interest borrowings to address these issues and make sure people have food to put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelvin. Cheryl, do you want to answer? Do you have a response to that? Or?
Yeah, my response is that this seems awfully familiar because whenever you ask Pakatan their revenue policy, the answer is always cut leakages. And Kelvin mentioned, and I'll take your word for it, and I'm sure you're right, 47 billion. 47 billion saved, presumably over a long period of time. Our subsidy bill is 78 billion. So if you're going to say we're going to reduce petrol prices, if you're saying we're going to give all sorts of fancy, nice stuff to people, if you say we're going to give free education or whatever it is your Pakatan Harapan manifesto will be in the next few months, you've got to do better than say cut leakages, because 47 billion doesn't cut it. You've got to have a proper revenue plan. You cut GST. You cancel projects like HSR. You thought you would save money but end up bayar papasan. This is the problem in Pakatan Harapan's thing. Their entire operations is to demonize Barisan Nasional, make it as if we are not fit to govern, but when they actually have the keys to power, look at what they actually did in 22 months. They cut assistance. And before you tell me you've got to compare apples and apples, 22 months, 60 tahun dah BN dah rosakkan negara. Sometimes it doesn't matter whether it's 22 months ke, 22 hari ke, 22 tahun ke. It's what you do in a time and power that matters. And actually certain actions show who you actually are. And those are the things that Pakatan Harapan did. And that is why, even if there is a credibility problem and a corruption image problem with my party, which I admit that we've got to improve, in the end, in the election, we'll still win because we are the one credible enough to run this country.
Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our first part, this first segment of the question on inflation. We will now be moving on to a fundamental part of the Malaysian political system, which is the second part of the second segment. Race has been a dominant aspect of Malaysian politics since the inception of our motherland. Political parties are still largely race-based or dominated by a single race. My question, gentlemen, is this. Practically, are race-based parties still needed to represent or protect the interests of their respective races? Why are we perpetuating this notion, this idea, that only a Malay can protect the Malay community, that only a Chinese can protect the Chinese community, and that only an Indian can protect the Indian community? Is it time to do away with race-based political parties? I will first like YB, one of my advisors, to give his opening remark.
There has been a remark made by various parties in the past 20 years that the triumph of liberal democracy and the end of Cold War will spell the end of history, of course, famously argued by Fukuyama. But as we have observed lately, despite the world or democracy throughout the world is moving away from so-called race-based, identity-based politics, it came with a vengeance. But this time around will be different because it comes with a package called populism. The rise of Trump, Viktor Orban, and others, strongmen in Western democracy, shows that you cannot deny the basic structure of human politics rests on racial and religious identity. With that, I also would like to conclude Malaysia, being a nascent post-colonial country, still has to navigate through the remnants of British divide and rule policy. We are still stuck in the communal mindset across all sectors. But of course, that does not mean we cannot transcend that in our politics. When it comes to governing the country, we all need each other. Hence, coalition-based politics would normally taper off and temper such influence or such stigma. And I believe, moving forward, definitely race-based parties or politics will remain relevant. But for the sake of salvaging our future, there are many issues and challenges that require us to go beyond such notions. When it comes to, for example, improving our governance, creating more jobs, creating more prosperity, I fully support anything or any policies that subscribe or hinges on need-based policy. But without also denying the fact there still need such policy or affirmative action in that matter, which targeted based on racial needs, whether it's for Malay, Indian, Chinese, Sarawakian, Sabahan, doesn't matter, because justice rests on such notion as well. And the issue at hand is this: how do we ensure race-based politics remain palatable and also tolerable to everyone? Of course, one cannot weaponize racial and religious issues just in order to garner votes. I'm not accusing UMNO or Bersatu, I'm accusing DAP as well. We all know DAP being, despite calling themselves a democratic party or socialist-based party, the support rests mainly based on certain particular race in this country. And if you were to study the rhetorics played by some of the leaders, not all of the leaders, we could see they also perpetuate race-based politics despite denying or asking for a more egalitarian approach in politics. So that's where I rest my case.
Thank you, YB. All right. I would now like to invite Saudara Syaril Hamdan to deliver his opening remark.
Thank you. This is a tough topic for anyone to speak of. What works best for Malaysia when it comes to race and politics to me is what actually works. And I mean that in a literal sense. In the sense that we can't speak of race and politics as if we are, and Waf will appreciate this since, he drops philosopher names all the time. We can't talk of it like, behind a veil of ignorance like John Rawls. We don't exist in that situation. We exist in this particular reality. And in this reality, race matters and race consciousness exists in this country. For me, really, when I think about it, for two reasons. One, because of our history. When I say history, generally speaking, how we got independence, sort of the quid pro quo agreement that we all understand and we all read in history. Sejarah menyebabkan race is weaved into our consciousness and into our constitution. But the second reason race consciousness matter, and this is where it's more important to me, is where it touches social justice. Not everything about social justice is racial, just to be clear, but some elements of it, some dimensions of it, is articulated and is understood via the lens of race. So, for example, when you have a situation where a Bumiputra graduate is less likely to earn the same amount as a non-Bumiputra graduate, I think there is an ethnic and racial element to that question of justice. And I gave a Bumiputra example. Somebody who's not Bumiputra can give a non-Bumiputra example where there's an ethnic dimension to inequality and inequality of opportunity. That, to me, is the limit of race consciousness that political parties should operate on. If, and I agree with Wafir, if you start weaponizing race for political ends, and every one of us, or rather every party represented on this stage has been guilty of that, then I think we are doing a disservice to the future of Malaysia. My parents are here, my mother is Chinese. So I speak from a very personal place when I say that race consciousness in Malaysian politics exists because of our history and because of the question of social justice. It should not dominate everything that we do. And I'm an UMNO guy. I'm naik ketua muda UMNO. And I say in every public forum that I can, that while I memperjuangkan kepentingan Melayu, it should be only limited to the point where it exists within a Malaysian story. So my concern is, how do I ensure that there are more Malay professionals? My concern is, how do I ensure that gaji dan pendapatan orang Melayu lebih tinggi daripada sekarang? My concern is, how do I make sure that in the VC space, for example, and the startup space, there are more Malays who get opportunities? My concern is how the Malays and Bumiputras exist in a transition economy where we want to move more into the green economy. That's my concern. It is not so that I feel that, I have to win. For Malays to win, non-Malays will have to lose. So that, I think, is the scope through which young Malaysians should exist or should talk about racial politics in a way that's not offensive, in a way that is magnanimous, in a way that does not justify any question of supremacy, because this is a country for all races. We all have a stake in this country, and just because we live and we exist in our own ethnic community does not preclude the fact that we want success for all Malaysians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother. I would like now to invite YB Kelvin Yee to deliver his opening remark.
Thank you so much. I just want to respond a little bit to Shara regarding the previous point you made. In terms of Pakatan, when I'm saying I'm not comparing apple to apple, I'm comparing in the sense that you cannot judge a 5-year report card in 2 years. In those 2 years, fundamentals were set. Actually, it's time to bear fruit. I can say it, and it's not just us praising ourselves, international ratings, because in terms of transparency perception, corruption index, democratic index, free press, it all increased. And you know very well, with fundamentals right, and good governance, anti-corruptions, things will be better after 5 years. I went back to the topic of politics of race. I like to take a different angle on this argument, because I strongly believe the core disease or the core problem, is actually economic anxieties and social insecurities. You see, the prominence of politics of race will somehow lessen if we address such anxieties. Of course, people tend to place race in terms of inequality. But when it is actually an issue of class, we have rich Malays, rich Chinese, poor Chinese, rich Indians, poor Indians, so on and so forth. Due to systemic and institutional issues, abuse of power, laws that have not been reviewed when it doesn't achieve its target, we have seen small groups of elites benefit, line up their pockets at the expense not just of the minorities, but the majority. And this is where we need to holistically address these inequalities and economic anxieties. And this can take form in universal interventionist policies, unemployment benefits, minimum wage that cut across race and ethnicity. In terms of affirmative actions, we have to look at economic and political realities. I'm not against it, especially if it achieves its target. But what I'm proposing and putting forth, that it can be expanded to address those that are economically vulnerable and visible. And these are things that we need to look at, and this focus of this policy should be oriented towards building capabilities, self-reliance, and eventually graduating from such affirmative actions. I myself do not believe in race politics. I myself understand the reality of Malaysian politics. I'm not naive. But I could not in good conscience continue to perpetrate such notions, be part of such parties. I believe I live in Sarawak. The city that I represent is Kuching, and we are known as the City of Unity. It is not because we are colorblind. I actually hate that term. But it's because we accept the spectrum of all colors and diversity. That is where, moving forward, we need to strengthen a Malaysian ethnic identity. It's not a monolithic one, but a plural diversity. We need to treat all cultures, Hari Raya ke, Tahun Baru Cina ke, as our celebrations. And this includes harnessing the strength and the gold mine of language in Malaysia. So for me, politics should be about policies and agenda based, framed around this Malaysian identity. We need to build a Malaysian identity by the famous quote of Dato' Sri Anwar. Anak Melayu, anak saya. Anak Iban, anak saya. Anak Cina juga anak saya. And based on yesterday's announcement, that actually literally came true. Thank you so much.
Thank you, YB. YB, now I would like to invite you to ask a question if you have any to any of the debaters.
Maybe I'll start with Saudara Waf. Many months ago, you mentioned that we need to accept that race politics is here to stay in Malaysia. As a young leader, why do you take that position? Wouldn't you want to change? Wouldn't you want to frame a different social norm? And again, I'm not saying it to deny our cultural identity, our heritage, but especially you in a position of a deputy unity minister. Shouldn't you be the forefront of changing this and including denying rights to minorities and even non-voting interests?
Thank you, Dr. Kelvin, for asking me such a question, which is paramount for us to address in this debate. Definitely, the ideal state that we like to achieve as a nation is to really have a mono identity that really carries what Malaysia is all about. But as we all know, Malaysia setup is quite different than our neighbors, for example, Indonesia. We do not practice forced assimilation. And the strength of our country when it comes to race-based politics is that we do respect each other's privileges and also institutions that protect their identities. And the reality that we have to accept is that the efforts are there to address and to create, to unite people on the basis of being Malaysian. But there's a parallel and communal channel or another dimension of our day-to-day lives where we are basically separated. I used to go to a daily school, a national school, when I was in primary, where I had wonderful multiracial friends and classmates. But as I progressed further to secondary school and also universities, yes, I still have such friends, but the social interaction has become lesser. And this, I believe, has to do with our inability to foster meaningful exchanges, dialogue, in our national language. And we have to create such forum in order for us to foster such interactions. And that's why I believe government is trying to do with our level best, with Keluarga Malaysia, with National Unity Department and others.
Thank you, Abi. Now I would like to invite Saudara Sharon if you have a question.
Yeah. Me directed to YB Kelvin. We used and we're familiar with this debate about whether you are this first or that first. Your chairman, Lim Guan Eng, once said that he's Malaysian first and Chinese second. Waf says he's Malay first and Malaysian second. Do you think it's healthy and useful to speak in these terms where you start ranking different parts of identity, or do you think there's a more productive way to speak about this issue?
Thank you so much, Sharon, for that question. And I agree with you. It is not a productive way of answering or even framing the question. Why can't I be a Malaysian and a Chinese first? Being a Malaysian does not mean, and I disagree with a mono single identity, but it can be a plural identity of being Malaysian. So instead of ranking, instead of looking at the lens, and Saudara Syariah, I'm sorry, I disagree when you talk about being part of UMNO politics. You are just looking at the Malay in the context of Malaysia as a whole. But I would like to try to challenge especially young people to shift their mindset to look at needs. Because as I said, this is not an issue of race. A lot of it is an issue of class, issue of discrimination, oppression of class. And this is the inequality that we have to address. So again, to answer your question, I would like to reframe the question rather than are you first this or second that, but how do you define yourself as Malaysian? How do you celebrate yourself as Malaysian? What is Malaysian pluralistic, multiculturalism, multi-religion all about? And trust me, that is our strength. We are at the gold line of world economy due to our culture, due to our multi-linguistic abilities. Let us harness that, let us focus on that rather than the issues that we have.
All right. Thank you, YB Kelvin. I would like to now invite Muhammad Faisal to give a question.
I would like to address Brother Sharia. We are from the same, basically, ideological party in terms of our Malay nationalism. I mean, UMNO and Bersatu, we are almost the same. No. Okay. But let us be honest, as Malay, as much as we want to progress further, I mean, here on stage, we could be some progressive or different breed of Malay leaders that hopefully we could do some changes in our people. But we are still facing a very critical issue, the crisis of Malay politics. The issue of governance, corruption, rests on the problem of politics or patronage, that which I believe has become so rampant in our Malay society. As a leader of UMNO, how do you plan to address this?
Yeah. If Bersatu and UMNO is very similar, maybe you should close off Bersatu and but I'll address the question. Facing this issue of Malay crisis of Malay politics, specifically patronage. See, I've read some of your stuff, which sometimes is interesting. And I've seen you go through mental gymnastics trying to explain how there's Malay custodianship and Malays need protectors. And I'm sorry, but it really seemed to me that you were apologizing for essentially a feudalist system that we as young Malay politicians need to change. So I would not try and understand, I would not try and justify or explain as to why, UMNO needs to exist because only UMNO can help Malays. That is something that some party colleagues of mine say, but inshallah, you will never hear me say it. Because I want Malays to support UMNO, not just because they're Malays. I want Malays to support UMNO because UMNO has the best policies for Malays and for Malaysia. So, I don't know. If you think in that paradigm and you think in that feudalist way, then maybe that's another reason why we are not the same. But if I can persuade you as a young politician, as a deputy unity minister, you got to think a different way of Malay politics. We've got to talk to our Malay constituency in a different language, in a way that doesn't scare them, doesn't fearmonger, but persuades them to support our parties based on a positive idea, not a scary, negative, defensive idea. So that's how I would imagine the future of Malay politics, and I think it's far more positive. And that's why tak payahlah satu tutup je dah masuk ni.
I would like to invite Adi Waf if he has a response to that.
Definitely, I made my stand on this issue. I just addressed that the issue of, say, for example, Malay needs protector as something that exists in our society. But definitely, I concur with Brother Sharil here. We can afford to have this kind of mentality moving forward when it comes to creating a better future for the nation. Because challenges are plenty, and that require us to transcend race-based consideration. And as much as you like to explain about the need for Bersatu to close down, I think the next election will determine the fate of both parties. And what I like to address or point about is that the problem lingers in our country today is because Malay politics is in crisis. As long as the Malays are divided, as long as the Malays cannot address some of the fundamental issues in our the moral decay that we are facing among our leaders, the crisis of our leaders, we will never come out from this dilemma that we are facing, and the country can never be stable. Stable, yes, you can achieve stability as what you've been championed about, but at what cost? As I said just now, I might not be popular in addressing this, but the issues, the elephant in the room when it comes to Malay politics, the identity, the patronage is still there. All the cases involve one MDB. I know it's not your fault, but it has to do with the way we Malays conduct our politics. And this needs a drastic change, which I believe is a common cause for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone on Faisal. Now we'll move on to the last topic of this segment, which is on, well, it's a topic for the future. It's climate change. Now, Malaysia has witnessed one of the worst floods this year, and it tested our government and civil society's capacity to respond. Now, the rate of climate change is extremely worrying, but moreover, the absence of any robust action is even more concerning. In light of our government's commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, the question I have to, the debaters today is, what is your plan to help Malaysia reach carbon neutrality by 2050? Is it turning to nuclear, investing into renewable energies like solar, or maybe even divesting away from palm oil? I'd like to invite YB Kelvin Lee for his formal speech.
Thank you so much. You mentioned just now this is an issue for the future. It is not. It is an issue for today. Because what we do today will affect our future. Malaysia is a signatory for the Paris Agreement, and our NDC, or National Determined Commitment, was to achieve a 45% reduction in carbon emission intensity by 2030 relative to the 2005 level. So, to break down, it was 35% unconditional, another 10% conditional upon, of course, international support in terms of financing and capacity building. Recently, the government actually announced that Malaysia's NDC is unconditional 45%. I personally see two main weaknesses in such a target. Why? And it can be improved, especially in the next review of the NDC. Number one, we should retain this 10% of conditional reduction rate on top of the 45% of unconditional to push developed countries to do more. There is joint responsibility in this, and we need to stand firm in our principle of climate justice. Number two, Malaysia should really consider using other measurements than carbon intensity in submitting our NDCs. Actually, there are fewer than 10 countries in the world that uses this, and Malaysia is one of them. This is because carbon intensity reduction target does not incentivize the adoption of low carbon practices and technologies. So by setting that target, I think there is much for us to improve on. What is my proposal? What can we do? We know generally there are two aspects of climate change actions. Mitigation, which is trying to reduce carbon, and of course adaptation on how to adapt to the changes due to climate change. It is important for us to have a common national climate goal and direction. And in order to have that, we need a centralized agency to coordinate all actions, climate actions, by different segments of society, different agencies, and different governments. This has been actually mentioned since 2009, based on public records. But Pakatan Harapan government, under the stewardship of YBOB, made talks into action and first formed the Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Center, which was launched in 2019. This is important, as I said, to coordinate policies among different ministries, to establish a roadmap of climate change in our country, to undertake data collection, run climate change risk analysis, and of course, to enhance R&D in terms of green tech development. This is the first step towards addressing climate change issues. What's next? Legislation changes have to happen. A climate change act has to be enacted in Malaysia, just like in the UK, France, and New Zealand. This is to ensure continuity in climate action, regardless of which political party in power. Basically, what this act makes is that the government is binded to the country's target of net zero, as well as to binded to climate change adaptation to reduce climate change related risks or issues or climate-related opportunities. So we need to develop institutional framework for mitigation and adaptation. Flooding is an adaptation issue, and we have seen one of the main problems in our country's adaptation. There is way too many ministries, it is way too fragmented, there's way too many bureaucracies. Let us build all in one. Let's build one environmental ministry which handles all. And this is done in the UK, in Japan, in China. Right now there's CASA, there's KETSA, there is local government that handles waste management. It is so messy. If we treat ministries, ministerial portfolios as political rewards, this is what happens. During Pakatan Harapan time, not only we put talk into action, we had one woman who handled it all. And this has to happen. We need good governance and we need proper bureaucracy in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, YB Kandoni. Now over to YB1 Ahmad Faisal for your 4 minutes.
When it comes to climate change, we must view this issue from a more holistic point of view. It's not solitary Malaysian issue or national issue. In fact, in order to combat or to reduce the carbon footprint or to mitigate any crisis, climate change related crisis, it requires a collaborative effort regionally and internationally. And one of the major things that I must agree with Dr. Kelvin on the aspect of having a climate change act from the government to show our commitment. But what can be done at our local level is that I think on top of producing, securing our food supplies, is to really for government to unlock various potentials and also reduce all the structural impediment to create more self-sufficient and sustainable economy, local economy. What I mean by that is that, for example, if we were to allow, which I think government is addressing, most of our food import being imported from abroad, definitely that contribute much to the problems of climate change, regionally and internationally. But by having a more locally based produce, by having incentives, loans, and also cooperatives, I think we can really start a new way of sustainable economic production. And we all know that when it comes to regional and international instability that we are facing in Ukraine and Russia, when it comes to war, in fact, the future escalation in this region, the government cannot rely solely by importing food. Wakaf land, for example, which being administered by religious bodies at the state level, must come together and pull their acts together and find ways to allow more people to participate in utilizing those abandoned lands. And I believe this can be facilitated by having proper federal and state level engagements, which I believe currently ongoing. And it will definitely usher a new way of doing things in addressing climate change. Of course, the issues of deforestation is a very critical one, which I personally agree that it has to be reduced remarkably in order to secure us from ever impending danger such as massive flooding that had never occurred before. For example, last year, it could be contributed to deforestation, but also there could be more proper projects implementation when it comes to irrigation and when it comes to building highways and buildings. Local authorities must plan better in order and take into account the impact of such designs to our climate sustainability. And this, I believe, must be one of the major important discussion policy points for upcoming GE15, and it has to be cross bipartisan and transcend political affiliation in order to make it work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, YB. So, Shara Hamdan, your 4-minute speech, please.
Yeah, isn't it? It's ironic that this is the last section of the debate, but it's also the most important. And we've traded blows, and politics is a contact sport. And we talk about race, and we talk about this and that. But what is the point of race if in 150 years most of us will be dead? And not to sound overly alarmist, but there are real data, there's real evidence showing that this is the biggest existential threat for humanity. And it doesn't matter if, whatever race, religion you are, this is the biggest issue facing our generation. And especially personally to me, I have a 4-year-old daughter. I hear Waf has just gotten a child as well. And that is where our entire conversation has to be about. It's about ensuring the next generation doesn't actually face mortal threat because of climate crisis and because of climate change. So that's a big statement. What do we as Malaysia, one small country, do to fix it? We're not going to be able to fix it on our own, but there are measures that we need to be doing. For me, the biggest theme here is bagaimana nak merakyatkan respon kepada krisis iklim. Merakyatkan. It has to be relatable. Right now, we have all these grand targets about, COP26, our minister went and said that we'll reduce it by X, but his own ministry doesn't use electric vehicle. Yeah, I've got to be honest here, and this is, again, I agree, this is not a partisan point. This is a wake-up call for all of us on the stage and the ones not in this room even, about how we need a whole of society approach that begins with making it relatable. And for me, making it relatable is around this particular small idea I have. It's not my idea, but it's basically a sense of how do we make sure carbon trading and carbon credit become something that even normal citizens can be a part of. You know, I just spoke to this fantastic guys from Johor, EcoRide. They're a company that basically leases electric vehicles to customers and to companies to reduce their carbon footprint. That's just one step and nobody knows about it, and there is no way to get invested in it as a normal citizen. My sense is we need to get to a point where, even as regular citizens, we change our behaviors and carbon trading and carbon credit becomes a currency that actually matters. So imagine, Kevin, if instead of coming here via Grab, we cycle here, or instead of using an ICE car, we actually use an EV. We sell on that carbon credit to a local council, which is something that Johor is actually starting to do. And that state or that council sells onto a national or international market. That entire infrastructure, I'm sorry to say, does not exist today. I have no clue what the current thinking is in terms of people in power, both at state and federal level, and what they actually intend to do to get to a point where we can have this carbon trading system, which, like I said, is cascading all the way from the top to the normal citizen level. So I feel that this is it's not, it's clearly not an oven-ready solution, but carbon trading and carbon credit is for me how we begin to merakyatkan perubahan iklim. And if we can do that the next 5 to 10 years, and we can be non-partisan about this, and we can really think about the future, I think that's where we can contribute to a safer and better generation.
Thank you so much for that. Now we'll move on to the questions. Saudara Syarah Hamdan, do you have any questions for any of the debaters?
So I think this part is not really about being aggressive or belligerent. I think I just want to ask the same question to both. Like, if you could pick one or two things to do immediately in the next 1 or 2 years, what would it be? On climate change and climate crisis, either one thing.
For me, I think there's a dearth of interaction and engagement with our religious institutions when it comes to promoting solutions at the local level. When our ustaz and ulama do not talk about this at the mosque or schools, as we all know how influential they are in the society, at least in the Malaysian society, we will definitely not gaining the possible traction as what Syariah has promoted, which is merakyatkan issue climate change. Because we have been used to live in a very modern way of lifestyle. We live in a very energy-intensive environment. But in the past, I think our forefathers had a better green and sustainable living, which not only for the Malays, but also for other traditions. So the only thing that I would do is to really engage our religious leaders to promote that issues from the Islamic point of view, and perhaps in other religious institutions, like Buddhism and Christianity. I'm sure there are wealth of information and arguments and solutions from such a group of people.
I think the first thing I'll do is what I mentioned just now. It's a climate change act. In 2019, the Pakatan Harapan government set a 2-year target for it to be tabled. It is actually not that hard because we have good models from the UK especially, and they were working professional relationships with the UK government to help the Malaysian government set up this act. We need to bind and legislate actions on climate change. Number two that I would really want to do, and I want to pivot into this, is to stimulate the green economy and creating sustainable jobs for Malaysians. As you can see in the 3 topics, the main underlying theme I want to address is it comes down to jobs, jobs, and jobs. So you see, a low carbon is an ambitious plan. It is a morally good plan, but it is also a good commercial plan to generate for economy. We need to show people that in RE and in EE, there is economic and commercial sense for our future generations, for our young people to have a viable commercial field even in climate change. And that is my view, how we can climate change. Because when you make it mainstream, you make it sustainable, and you make it good for the economy and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the debaters. Now, I'll now like to invite YB and Muhammad Faisal to ask a question to any one of the debaters.
What are your opinions, both to both panelists, on Malaysia going nuclear? Malaysia going nuclear power. Having our first nuclear power plant as part of our energy mix to secure a more cleaner and sustainable energy supply.
Yeah, I have to admit this is not something that I'm particularly well versed in. Off the bat, not for it, personally, for the same reasons that we worry about obviously the implications and the safety concerns whenever nuclear generation is in conversation. But I don't feel super strongly about it, because I don't know enough about it. But I think I want to use the opportunity to say, if we don't go nuclear, what do we do to reduce our emissions in electricity generation? Because that's the main question. And my sense is, Captain, you in Parliament, I wonder if there's a way Parliament can push for early decommissioning of coal-fired power plants. How much will it cost? I imagine it's expensive, but instead of spending on the stuff that maybe is not the best use of our resources and our government funds, why not use the model where we basically pay off IPPs early, retire the coal-fired power plants, don't worry about our reserve margin, because then we can put online solar energy and renewable energy. That's my sense, as somebody who's not fully well versed. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, especially in Parliament. Is there an appetite across parties to basically retire coal-fired power plants faster?
To answer the question, that conversation has not been brought up to public. And the fact of the matter, I think in Parliament we have room for improvement, especially to increase our climate change discourse. I think not many MPs, to be fair, have, of course, the expertise, the appetite to discuss on what is needed, especially on this existential crisis. To answer WAF, I'm against nuclear, and if you look at the trend around the world, they're actually moving away from nuclear to other renewable energies, whether it's hydro, and now the big trend is, to a certain extent, hydrogen technology. Solar is technology in Malaysia. We have some projects that have been done. Of course, again, I'm not an expert. If you ask me something about healthcare, I'll go on rambling. But there are alternatives, and if we look at trends around international market, especially, they're moving away. There is a reason why they're moving away, and I think there are more ways that we can explore. But on Cheryl's suggestion, I think I would suggest to Parliament, and I'll speak to the Speaker, to really have an environmental select committee so that we have robust discussions on climate actions, robust discussion on climate policies, and get this act passed, because we have been procrastinating for too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Now, onto the final question. I'd like to invite YB Kelvin to ask one question to any of the panel, debaters.
As I said, I think the next step, we have taken the first step to form a centralized agency. Now we need to centralize a ministry. Next, we need to pass an act. As I said, it is a low-lying fruit. Countries have done it. We have good models. In your capacity as both in your parties and your political leadership, what would you do to further this agenda?
So I think what I will answer is contained in my introductory remarks really, just to reiterate. And I completely agree with you about jobs. Once you have an ecosystem that has carbon credit in the middle, and it is part of our education system, it is part of how people think of wealth and investment, it is part of how people behave, then I think you get to a point where the entire country is invested. I think it's also telling that this room's energy fell down when we started talking about climate crisis. So even among the younger generation, we've got to do better job than wealth, because it is not something that people seem to be excited about, passionate about, because it's not as news-making as some things. But I think once you start telling them, if you invest in this kind of action, you get carbon credits which you can sell overseas and you boleh kaya. Then I think people start to get interested in it. But that's the part where I think the ecosystem has not started, and if we can begin it at our generation and our level, then I think we've done something great for this country.
Yes, for me, I would like to, of course, you are going from the parliamentary channel to reform or institute a solution, but I think some low-hanging fruits that I think we can do or promote on bipartisan basis is that to persuade the government to include or reform our GLC, GLIC's social mandate by focusing on this aspect. I mean, we do have a lot of funds that can be tapped for our entrepreneurs, our startups in climate change that could offer some solutions. And I believe if we have a clearer picture or framework for this, we can really popularize the solutions further without waiting for government to create an act. Yeah.
Thank you to all speakers. We'll now be moving on to the third segment, ladies and gentlemen. However, due to time constraints, the Q&A will be cut short to only 10 minutes. We will now open the floor to members of the audience to ask a question. To ask a question, please kindly line up behind the microphone stands located at designated areas of the room. You may ask your question when called upon. Please state to whom your question is directed. Keep it concise without any follow-ups. We'll open the first question to this gentleman over here, am I right? Yeah.
Hi, hello. This is Ismail here. So I have one question that was specially created for several shareholders. So I really hope that you can provide some sorts of impactful answers to me. So, Ryan, you were probably the first nation to be eager to bring up MMT as a story to deal with or to consult with the economy. So it basically always presented with the printing out more money. So is it true, or is it just a gross or just a simple simplification on that? And if not, then what exactly is all about? And the last question for me is how will your understanding differ from Wadi Bob, who has directly or partly proposed direct labor money to the people? Thank you. So that's my question.
Gentlemen, any of you want to go first?
So answer straight away. Yeah. So thank you for the question. The question was MMT and how I differ from one Faisal who wants to print money. So I think first and foremost, this stuff is quite technical. Economics is quite a celebrated discipline, and people spend years and years of research. And even then, things are nuanced, things are complicated. There's no black and white answer. And so I want to keep this as simple as possible. For me, there's two parts to MMT. So for people who don't know MMT is modern monetary theory. You can just Google it later. There's two parts. To me, there's the descriptive part and the prescriptive part. MMT to me describes government's financing and how government funds its expenditure in the most accurate manner, in my opinion. We cannot think of government spending in the same way we think of household spending. In a household spending, like you and me, our expenditure is limited by our income. if you want to spend more than you earn, you will have to borrow, and later on you have to pay back that borrowings anyway with interest. So in the end, your spending is limited by your earning potential or your income. Benda ni kena panjang ni. So what does that mean? Means in a household you are limited by your income. But government doesn't work that way. Government works in a way where government does not actually, its spending power is not actually limited by tax revenues. Now this sounds controversial, but it's descriptively true. Why? Because government is an issuer of money. So government issues debt in its own currency can never be bankrupt. So that's a description of MMT that is true. That is technically true. Even COVID shows that Keynes's quote is always correct, which is that whatever we can actually do, we can afford. But the prescription is where we have to be careful. Because I don't agree with my friend here that you can just simply say print money and everything will be okay. If economics is about printing money, then tak payah belajar lah jauh-jauh. Memang macam tu selesai masalah. It's what you spend on that matters. And you have to spend on increasing productive capacity. Because if you spend simply to get people more money in their pockets, but the goods and services don't improve, don't increase in value, what will happen? Inflation. Because inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. But if government spends and pump primes the economy, increases the productive capacity, does stuff that actually increases our supply side, then you mitigate the risk of inflation. So in short, MMT explains how government financing works, but the real world warns me that if we have that knowledge, we have to be careful in the kind of words that we use and don't simplify matters until the entire discipline of economics is disrespected or done a disservice. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. The next question I must emphasize must be directed to either YB Kelvin or YB Wan. I would like to invite the gentleman from the center of the hall, please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Kazrin, and I would like to ask to YB Wan Faisal. YB, during your tenure as a Deputy Minister of Youth and Sports, you have been attacked for your comments regarding on several issues, such as on the vernacular school issues and many more. And now we are also have been criticized on your comments regarding on the border issues. So I would like to ask you, how do you balance between your positions or between your capacity as a youth chief of party Pribumi Bersatu Malaysia, which is well known as a Malay-centric party, and your current position in the cabinet as a Deputy Minister of Unity? Because, for me, most of your stance are divisive. And
Please,
yet,
please get to the question, please.
Yet your position is about, or your portfolio is about unity. How do you balance for both of them? Thank you.
Thank you, Tazrin, for a very short question. I think I've answered this quite a few times in the parliament as well. I think it's not an issue for me being a youth chief of a Malay-based party, and also as a national deputy minister of national unity, and positing my position as such when it comes to Buan Odori or the vernacular school. As I said, in Malaysia, we like to speak a lot about problems, but we rarely want to address the elephants in the room. When it comes to the issue of national unity, we have various issues with regard to, for example, vernacular school, with regard to the usage of Bahasa Melayu, the syllabus in our schooling system. So these are the things that if we do not want to discuss, these are sensitive issues, mind you, it could create a lot of controversies. But alas, it's very important. I think I've raised few of those issues either publicly in my writings or in some of my short comments. And suffice to say, as long as it doesn't contradict the constitution of the country and doesn't wrong the historical narrative of this country, I think all of us have such space to discuss it and find common ground to resolve those. And I think that's where I believe I stand corrected, where my position politically and my government position currently does not contradict with one another. In fact, I believe, being a Malay nationalist myself, I could bring certain angle to such debate, where most people tend to sweep it under the carpet. We need to be honest and frank to each other. If not, we can never resolve such issues forever. Thank you.
Thank you, YB. Ladies and gentlemen, the next question is the last question, and it should be directed to YB Kelvin. Any individuals?
Hello. Alright, so as I want to ask one question to Mr. Kelvin today. Regarding what one person has said before, so in 2050, he said and quoted, there is no injunction in the Quran that asks us to unite unless we are Muslim. And I don't want to misquote you. So I will take here. So I will take here. So now, I just want to ask Mr. Kelvin, what do you think about having this kind of person who said this on the stage? And yeah, maybe a comment, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question and a very creative way of asking it. I am in no position to comment about a religion or any religion for that matter. But based on the question I asked Saudara Waf at the beginning, as a young leader, as the Deputy Minister of Unity, what is his responsibility? To perpetuate? Yes, I understand systemic issues. Yes, I understand long-term mindset, to a certain extent narrative. But could he, in his right conscience, continue to be part of it and accepting it as a final eventuality without the need to do something and change it? And that is something I cannot accept. Even if I fail, even if we lose elections, but I'm going to fight for the concept of the multiculturalism and the Malaysian identity, because that is what I see the future of Malaysia. And that's what I see the future for you all, a politics that is based on agenda and policies, politics that are based on the people rather than the color of our skin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, YB. Gentlemen, we have now reached the final segment of the debate. I would first like to invite YB Muhammad Faisal to give his opening remark. Yes, to conclude, yes.
We have come to the end of this debate. It's been a very fruitful debate, controversial one, even colorful, in fact. But despite all the noises and colors that we could see and feel, still I would like to recap what I've said earlier. And yes, I thank you, Brother Sharif, for reminding all of us that we have young kids at home. When I speak about these issues, it's not about scoring political brownie points for my party or for myself. I speak from my heart. I'm very worried. The future is indeed bleak unless we do something or pull our acts together. Being a young politician, we are not being burdened by legacy issues. I believe that the Sharia can come stronger despite all the issues riddled in his party. He can chart his own course, so does Dr. Kelvin. And in order for us to really address the future of this country, I really would like to encourage all of you, especially the younger ones here, to be part of the solution rather than just a bystander of history. As what Arnold J. Toynbee quoted just now, if a particular nation or civilization fail to address the challenge among its creative minority. It's not the masses actually who resolve the issues. Democracy is the process, but those who provide the solutions are those who are learned and those who are able to come up with a solution that could really capture the imagination and the trust of the people. For example, in Islamic history, even in the Malay history itself, the one who do reforms across the ages are the scholars. And scholars, being the guardian of the Islam, the religion and Sharia, they would always address the root cause of any problems. I'll give you a good example of Imam al-Ghazali, the reformer of 11th century. In his time, it was not much different than ours. Corruptions were rife, Mongols were at the gate, the Tatars, and rulers, leaders were corrupted to the core. And it trickled down among the people as well. The only way forward for us to resolve this issue is to really restore our moral order. And that is where, as what Arnold J. Toynbee, who used to be agnostic, but came to a conclusion, the only way forward to revive a nation within all this crisis is the spiritual one. And this is where I believe politics is not the only means to resolve issues. I believe politics is just an institution, one of the institutions that could address such pitfalls. We need to go beyond that. We need to have scholars, teachers, community leaders, NGOs to be part of this. And we cannot move forward without having a clear framework how to restore such moral order. And this is where I believe religion and ethics and education play a paramount role to restore balance for this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Wabi Kalvini 4 minutes.
Thank you so much. And first and foremost, I would like to thank fellow debaters on this really robust discussion, focused on policies, ideologies, and of course, a way forward for our beloved Malaysia. Fact is, this is what politics is all about. It is not about juggling, fighting for positions, for political rewards or expediency. The people that we are supposed to protect and serve do not care if we politicians have a memorandum of agreement on who the DPM should be. They do not care how many prime ministers we want in a term, but they want to know how they can recover back from this crisis and put food on the table. We need to redeem back politics and make policies and agenda the center of mainstream politics. I have an aspiration to make politics boring again, to focus on policies rather than the drama and the scandal. You see, we have a party that is propagating the notion that we need strong majority for political stability so that investors will have confidence. I myself, I differ in opinion. What investors want is consistency and stability in policies, not a government without accountability. We cannot allow the progress that we have experienced since 2018. We have seen the PAC coming from the opposition, at that time from UMNO, and now from the AP. Who here can say having a PAC from the opposition is a bad thing? We cannot say the progress of having more select committees in Parliament is a bad thing. We cannot let that digress or regress. A party that is asking for huge majority is running a risk of running things without the need for bipartisan politics. One thing we can learn from the MOU that PH signed with the PM is that politics should move beyond winner takes all and loser loses all. Young people, everywhere I go, I always encourage You guys have a huge role to play in this process. Let us together make politics boring. Investors are looking. The world is looking. What they are looking at is not just parties, but they are looking at consistent policies. We want to build a society that is diamond in shape, a big middle class, to reduce inequality. We want a nation where the young do not have to vote with their feet and run to Singapore, Australia, or the UK to earn a living. We want a nation where university graduates do not have to drive a Grab car. Again, not to say in a condescending way. We want a nation which the young can live a better life than their parents. And for that to happen, friends, we need to work together. And we need a clean and competent and fair, economically fair government for our living nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. However, talking about 4 minutes of opening remarks.
Sure, I don't know if I'll take up all 4 minutes. I want to thank everyone and the organizers. And I think in this 1-2 hours, you've seen what politics in Malaysia is. We agree on the issues and we agree broadly the framework, but we will take pot shots at one another. And that's really what is facing us at this point in time. We know that the world doesn't wait. We know that the world is strenuous. We agree that certain fundamental things need to shift. There might be disagreements about the priorities or who should do what first, when and where. But broadly speaking, we need to have clear plans and we are open to bipartisan and generational cooperation and thinking. But as we think about the long term, as we think about how we make these fundamental and systemic changes, the choice is short term. And I was going to go statesman-like until I heard Kelvin. So I want to remind all of us, and sorry, I'm not going to do this, the choice is short term. The choice is, do you pick a party that has a PhD in listing out all the problems, tapi super kindergarten in actually solving them? Or do you pick a party, which is mine, which has the real plan and real credibility to actually fix what needs to be fixed in the medium term and the short term? And I feel, I feel that all you have to look at when you look at my opponents at the left and right, while we agree on a bunch of stuff, what you have to look at is a track record that they did. And they, with the track record, they got into power with all the sea of hope and the sea of expectation. But when they promise youth unemployment, remember what they did. When they promise higher wages, remember what they did. When they promise that they will reduce unequal development, remember what projects they canceled. When they spoke about government debt and made everyone be scared about 1 trillion ringgit debt, remember what they did, Bon Samurai. That is what you have to remember when you make this short-term choice. None of us on this stage is evil. We all want Malaysia to succeed. But you got to pick right. In the coming months, you will have a choice. Choose stability, choose credibility, choose my party. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of MSLS 3 Counter Debate. And once again, I'd like to thank our distinguished guests on stage. We hope the debate was intriguing, vigorous, and encapsulating. I'll now like to invite our speakers to remain on stage beside with me, the chairperson-elect of UKEC, to present a token of appreciation to our debaters. Our photographer will be capturing this special moment. Right, thank you so much. Now, for the press, an executive member from the UKAC will be at the door. You can see her raising her hand over there. She'll bring you to the press conference room. Now, I'd like to remind the participants, please, don't stop the speakers. They gotta go to the next event. Now, I'll pass it back to our MCs, Chai-Jin and Kevin.
Thank you for the heated debate. It was truly an eye-opening experience to see different perspectives being put forth. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be entering our closing keynote shortly.